Welcome to the Autonomic Healing Podcast. I'm Tom Pels.
And I'm Ruth Lawrenson. We'll be unpacking what it looks like to activate your brain to holistically manage stress and trauma that bring healing to the mind, body, and spirit.
Being free to live authentically as humans.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started. Hey Tom, we're here and we are going to have a conversation about trauma. I asked if you would have a conversation with me on this podcast about trauma because I think that there are just so many questions about it, and I know that it was challenging for you.
Oh yeah.
Even just asking you to do this conversation. Do you want to just tell me why that was?
Because my whole life, professionally, for decades, has been about trauma. As a minister, there's so much of it. As a therapist working in offense-specific treatment, forensic therapy, that's all trauma. And in my private practice, it was about trauma.
And so, like, it didn't make you feel very excited.
It was daunting.
Yes.
Because of all that history, which was traumatic, and the vicarious trauma. And, of course, I had a reaction, and we'll unpack that today in the conversation.
And one of the things we were talking about just earlier on was how, you know, we have this range of, how we represent different spaces, cultural spaces in society. So, you know, when you were growing up, when you were doing your ministry and your whole career, trauma wasn't talked about that much.
It was essential to it. It was acknowledged, but it really wasn't. It was weirdly not the focus or talked about. And I'm going to bring up in a little bit the post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
That's only a few decades old as a diagnosis. And I lived a lot of my life before there was even such a thing. And I lived it with that.
Yeah. I think it is healthy that we're talking about trauma a lot more.
Oh, absolutely.
I remember just a friend of mine just saying, can you do, like, they actually asked me, can you do an episode on trauma? Because I don't actually know what it is. And maybe we're talking about it so much and we can use that word, oh, it's traumatic or it's trauma. And what actually is it? You know, what's the impact of trauma? Really what we're looking at is how we heal from trauma. But the reason why I brought it up was because I think that we, in some ways, we've swung right the other way and we're talking so much about trauma. My generation, it's like, you know, we're all in therapy.
and that's
it's
really
great.
is a very healthy thing, because I was raised by the greatest generation, the World War II generation, and I was raised by them, and there wasn't such a thing as trauma. Nobody was traumatized. Nobody ever had any trauma. Times got tough, and things were hard, but you just, what's the British phrase? You just crack on. You just get on with it, and it was so unhealthy. I can remember many funerals that I officiated at, and people would be like, yeah, boy, that's a good friend. I guess I'll miss him. Seriously? He was your best friend. And you're not grieving? No.
So we're definitely, I feel, and maybe it's just my space, so I don't want to kind of generalize this too much, but I feel like we're moving, you know, my generation, the generations below me are moving way more into owning our stories, understanding trauma. We talk about it all the time. We talk about, you know, there's so many, I think there's an acknowledgement that we've just been through global trauma with our experience
and
with
don't
COVID.
know what to do with it and don't have the resources.
So I wanted to have this conversation because I think it's helpful to have some sort of definition around trauma. And, you know, we don't want to have a conversation about trauma just to traumatize ourselves, obviously, but I think there is like balance here. Like, how do we in this really big topic that we're now talking about, which again, like you say, is better than not talking about it. But how do we get the wisdom? How do we get the grounding in this? How do we get the tools to know what to do with it? How do we know how it impacts us? And ultimately, I think the big question is, how do we heal from it? But can you kick us off a little bit in this giant topic?
Yeah. And when you suggested the idea of trauma as a podcast conversation, my initial reaction was, where in the world do I even start?
Yeah.
For many, even bringing up the subject of trauma is traumatizing. And then I thought about conversation about trauma would be like opening Pandora's box, which is ironic because that's what Pandora's box actually is, unleashing trauma. For those who aren't familiar with the story of Pandora's box or haven't seen Tomb Raider, The Cradle of Life.
I've seen it.
There you go. A little background in Greek mythology. Prometheus stole fire from heaven. Zeus was very unhappy about this and got revenge by presenting Pandora to Prometheus's brother, Epithemius. Epithemius had a jar that he left in Pandora's care. And she was curious, what is in that jar? And opened it, not knowing that within were sickness, death, and many other terrible evils, i.e. trauma, which were then released into the world. She closed it quickly, but the damage was done.
Yeah.
And only one thing was left behind, which is really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
The term can mean, in the Greek, either hope or a deceptive expectation. So, sort of like, be careful what you hope for, because you might just get it, but it isn't what you were thinking. The point is that trauma is at the heart of the matter, so to speak.
Yeah, that's so true.
And it's a devastated heart.
Yeah. I think that little bit that you just mentioned about Pandora's box, which I've never thought about it in that way, so thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
It's so true though, isn't it? It was opening
It's exactly what it was.
It was opening to trauma. But I loved what you said about she only opened it just for a moment. But the damage was already done. And I think when I think about trauma, it doesn't, some people do have prolonged trauma in their life, but actually the impact of trauma, it only has to be a moment and the damage is already done. But it seems to be very much at the heart of the matter, very much part of our human experience right now. It almost seems like just like being a human being is a traumatic experience.
Yeah.
And, for some people, obviously, much more than others,
Yeah. There's in Greek mythology, you have stories of the heroes or even the gods having intrusive thoughts about trauma. Way back then, thousands of years. And this is across cultures. When we're talking about trauma, it's important to have some understanding of what trauma actually is.
Yes.
And how it impacts people. But even that is easier said than done. Depending on the position you're looking at it from, trauma winds up being defined in many different ways, which is why your friend was saying, so what is trauma?
Yeah.
Everybody's talking about what is that? So a generally accepted definition of trauma, and one I like to use, is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience.
Thanks, Tom. I think that's really helpful because, I think when when we think what we've been through just recently, globally from these past 2 years, I think I describe going through a global pandemic as that,
deeply distressing and disturbing.
Totally.
Yeah.
So that means that there is certainly a global trauma that we've been through, but then individuals will have their own experiences with this. I mean, even just as you're listening now, if you think through those words, a deeply disturbed, how do you say it again?
Deeply distressing and disturbing
experience, so as individuals, we have, just even in our upbringings or the lives that work or family life, the complexities that can happen in that. I mean, there's lots and lots of examples there.
Yeah, and trauma is the gift that keeps on giving.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Okay.
So prior to an AHA session, I have people complete a stress history form that has a Likert scale. 0 is none to 10 is most severe assessment of stress, anxiety, depression, and anger. Stress, anxiety, depression, and anger are manifestations of a lack of homeostasis. And the impact of stress and trauma are often the end of life as we know it. So what I really want to make clear in this conversation is the perspective I now view trauma from, in contrast with the way I viewed it before AHA, and having a way to normalize the impact of trauma. See, before AHA, before I had a way to intervene in people's trauma, their own or my own, the prospect of dealing with trauma was daunting. Now with a way to normalize trauma, it is, dare I say, rousing, refreshing, and rewarding.
That's so good, Tom. And I remember, that's such a big difference, isn't it? And just even with some of the you're reminding me of some of the guests that we've had on, like Josh and Brittany and Chris, Stephen A, just the last conversation we had.
And we've got some others coming.
Yeah. But I think from a therapist point of view, treating trauma has been daunting. It's like, what do we do with it? Like, because actually it just has its impact deeply in a human being.
Its claws.
Totally. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was actually seeing that in my mind as I was just talking. But I remember that Chris, I don't know if you remember this, but in the last episode, Chris talked about, he's a therapist, and he said his wife recognizes by his mood the type of therapy he's going to do that day.
Yeah.
So if he's doing AHA sessions, he tends to be more joyful and hopeful and energized because he knows that at the end of those sessions, his clients are no longer going to be traumatized. I mean, that's a really big deal as a therapist, just to know we're making progress. I mean, it can be very defeating to feel like you're not making progress.
Not just putting Band-Aids on wounds, but seeing the wounds heal.
Yeah.
So not long ago, I asked a client at the end of his AHA session, as I always do, what he thought of observing his own brain normalizing his prior stress and trauma. And I've shared what clients have said before, and we've given all those quotes in an earlier episode. But I'm sharing this because it speaks directly to the impact of trauma on self-image and self-esteem. And that's that fourth core issue that results from feeling inadequate and insecure and powerless and a lack of control. And then we have that unhealthy self-image and poor self-esteem. So before the session, he had rated that 0 on that 0 is none and 10 is most severe scale. His stress generally is 8.
So 10's max. High. Yeah.
Anxiety was 4. Depression was 8. And anger, particularly toward himself, is 10.
Wow.
Most severe.
Yeah.
And in the trauma section of the stress history form, he had noted at the age of 3, patches of memory concerned me. That was it. He didn't elaborate because his memories of childhood were not only indistinct, but too disturbing to consciously process, let alone acknowledge. Trauma does that to memory. Trauma makes certain memories unreachable or certainly untouchable. That's called repression. When we've experienced trauma, the mind knows we just can't manage remembering. So rather than suppressing, which is a healthy way to manage the recall of distressing thoughts, we repress them. Suppression is being aware of the trauma or stress, but holding it down, managing it consciously. That's suppression.
So that's kind of like, you would say that would be healthy because at least I guess you're aware of it.
Yep.
You know this could affect you, so it's not like everything's perfect, but it's at least you're aware.
I'm aware of it and I'm managing it. And rather than having it manage me, suppression. Some traumas are simply too big and the impact too great to consciously be aware of and hold down. I've likened suppression and repression to being in the water sitting on a large inflatable ball. which is a very unstable position to be in. I mean, mental picture, you're in the pool and you've got this large beach ball you're sitting on. Trauma is the inflatable beach ball. It puts us in a very unstable position. With suppression, we're consciously aware of the beach ball, but are holding it down and working to maintain our balance. Repression is another thing entirely. Repression is shoving something out of conscious awareness. That didn't happen. What are you talking about? I have no idea. Repression is often necessary for survival and just getting on with living. It's not healthy because it leaves us vulnerable to acting on impulse when it's triggered. Have you ever done something unhealthy impulsively and wondered, why did I just do that?
Yes, many times.
Not even understanding the motivation and unable to identify the prior experience that prompted it? That's a sure sign of a traumatic experience that's been repressed.
Huh, that's interesting. So basically when you're acting out, you have no reason you don't realize, like something's happened to you and you're reacting in an overt way and you're like, why am I reacting like that?
Going on?
It's almost like a sign that there's something there that's being...
Not almost, it is. Curiously and very beneficially, activating homeostatic mechanisms in AHA can actually allow your brain to inform you of what the experience actually was. I remember a client who, for the life of her, couldn't understand why she had acted impulsively in a particular situation that really damaged her primary relationship, and had been thinking that it was about a prior relationship with her parents, but that didn't really make sense to her. And then she thought, well, maybe it's about that friend situation from when I was younger. But when she did an AHA problem-solving session about it, her brain, and this is the involuntary autobiographical cognition or memory I've mentioned before, and we'll go in depth on in a future conversation when we're talking about AHAPS, her brain identified a completely different experience that she had actually thought was inconsequential. Hadn't really affected her at all.
Wow.
It's fascinating. So back to the beach ball.
Yeah.
Repression is being on top of the beach ball and not being aware that there's a beach ball under you and wondering why you feel so unstable.
It's very helpful, Tom, to understand, the difference of repression and suppression.
Mm-hmm.
I think just knowing the difference, it's when we don't know that the imbalance is there, that we end up becoming, we can end up going right into the tsunami of stress, right?
Yeah. And that isn't just in our bodies. That is in mind and spirit as well. And that sense of instability, that sense of just something isn't right.
Right. So so that imbalance comes right through our bodies, our minds,
absolutely,
and then spiritually as well.
Yeah, and our spirit, our being, who we are. So the corresponding perspectives related to trauma are, for the body, medical, and for the mind, psychological, and the spirit, well, spiritual. So it's interesting how there are different terminologies for body and mind, but not the spirit. I've wondered about that. So since psychological is from the Greek word for the mind, psyche, so psychological, then maybe spiritual could be from the Greek word for spirit, pneuma, pneumatical. Well, I can't imagine that ever catching.
You're going on a rabbit trail.
I have gone down the rabbit trail. Okay, so medically, trauma is defined as a major physical injury, as distinguished from a minor injury to the body. And trauma has a devastating impact on health. A very well-regarded piece of research found that approximately 80% of medical health problems are stress and trauma related.
That's crazy.
It's literally a killer.
I find it I find it fascinating and super helpful to know this information because of my own journey, actually. So
There isn't actually anything wrong, which in the past, and fortunately this is beginning to change, physicians are not coming to you with, it's all in your head.
I know,
Which isn't helpful because it isn't all in the head. It is in the body.
I think it's just that we haven't had, I mean, I think it's changing now, like you said, but I think we haven't had an approach that's connected mind, body, spirit.
No.
And it's very well documented that is true.
There's a diagnosis called somatization. That's the manifestation of stress or trauma in the body. And it's probably the least diagnosed medical condition. But because it's in the realm of mental health, it just hasn't caught in the medical community.
Yeah, and even, in some ways, even it's not just trauma, it's like stress and anxiety. I remember you saying to me once that mental health issues are actually stress and trauma issues. And I think, wow, that's so true.
So to get some perspective on trauma, from a mental health perspective, the DSM-5, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition, defines trauma as actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. So stressful events not involving an immediate threat to life or physical injury, such as psychosocial stressors like divorce, custody of children, loss of a job, bankruptcy, homelessness, are not considered trauma. Post-traumatic stress disorder was changed in the DSM from the 4th to the 5th editions, and not without controversy, because it was actually moved from an anxiety disorder, which is flight or fight. It's anxiety is feeling stress and need and trying to flee unsuccessfully. So it was moved from an anxiety disorder to a new diagnostic category, trauma and stressor-related disorders. And it also, though, made substantial changes by eliminating the more subjective aspect of trauma. I feel traumatized, therefore I am traumatized, regardless of some scientists' definitions. And it narrowed the criteria for diagnosis for trauma and changed the symptoms. Did you know, actually, that there wasn't even a diagnosis for post-traumatic stress disorder before 1980?
I know, that seems bizarre to me to think of that.
Yeah, because most people are going, no, it's always been. No, it hasn't. 1980.
I mean, that goes back to what we started this conversation with. It was, actually, it wasn't that long ago that some of the stuff just wasn't unpacked or diagnosed or talked about. And
the post-traumatic stress disorder as a diagnosis was introduced in the 3rd edition of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. There were 2 prior editions. It wasn't even in. So my dad's PTSD from World War II was not PTSD. It wasn't even shell shock, which is what they were talking about, because it wasn't from an explosion. My dad's trauma was primarily from having to kill an enemy soldier with his bare hands.
Wow.
It was either that he took the other man's life with his bare hands, or he killed himself.
Yeah.
That's traumatic.
It's hugely traumatic.
And that doesn't take into account all the other life or death situations he encountered on the islands of the South Pacific, let alone all the other stressors just of military service in the theater of war.
So your dad, with all of that he went through, wouldn't have fitted, the way that they describe trauma.
Right.
But of course he was traumatized.
Of course. And I experienced what it was like to have a dad with PTSD. So the first known use of the term combat fatigue or battle fatigue came in 1943, and it wasn't generally used until after World War II, since the war ended in 1945, and it was 1980 before there was post-traumatic stress disorder. So perhaps more helpfully, the American Psychological Association defines trauma as, quote, any disturbing experience that results in significant fear, helplessness, dissociation, confusion, or other disruptive feelings intense enough to have a long-lasting negative effect on a person's attitudes, behavior, or other aspects of functioning. Traumatic events include those caused by human behavior, in other words, rape, war, industrial accidents, as well as by nature, like earthquakes, or dare I say tsunamis, and often challenge an individual's view of the world as a just, safe, and predictable place. Or any serious physical injury such as a widespread burn or a blow to the head. It goes on to say that trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event, like an accident, rape, or natural disaster. Immediately after the event, shock and denial are typical. Longer-term reactions include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and even physical symptoms like headaches or nausea. So in 2016, there was a report of findings titled The Epidemiology of Traumatic Event Exposure Worldwide.
Wow.
Results from the World Mental Health Survey Consortium. The criteria used in the survey, and this is 2016, so it's pre-COVID. The survey was from, the criteria used in the survey was from the DSM-5, which I talked about earlier. So the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders defines a traumatic event as limited to exposure to threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. So that was a criteria. And various different types of experiences of threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence, because there's all sorts of different types of things that we can experience. Okay? So, and remember, the DSM-5 criteria is much more limiting than the generally accepted understanding of trauma. So, from the abstract, the background for the study was that considerable research has documented that exposure to traumatic events has negative effects on physical and mental health. And talk about an understatement. That is. Much less research has examined the predictors of traumatic event exposure. Increased understanding of risk factors for exposure to traumatic events could be of considerable value in targeting preventive interventions and anticipating service needs. So, related to the method, there was a general population survey in 24 countries with a combined sample of 68,894 adult respondents across 6 continents that assessed exposure to 29 traumatic event types.
Wow.
Difference in prevalence was examined with cross-tabulations. Exploratory factor analysis was conducted to determine whether traumatic event types clustered into interpretable factors. Survival analyses was carried out to examine associations of socio-demographic characteristics and prior traumatic events with subsequent exposure. And this is where eyes are glazing over.
I'm fully with you, Tom. I appreciate the detail.
No, this is an eyes glazing over moment. Anyway, so the results, though, is that over 70% of respondents reported a traumatic event.
Wow.
And 30.5% were exposed to 4 or more types. 5 types: witnessing death or serious injury, the unexpected death of a loved one, being mugged, being in a life-threatening automobile accident, and experiencing a life-threatening illness or injury, accounted for over half of all exposures. This is pre-COVID.
Wow.
So exposure varied by country, socio-demographics, and history of prior traumatic events. Curiously, being married was the most consistent protective factor. In other words, being in a stable, long-term relationship, because you're not going it alone, was protective. Community is so important. Exposure to interpersonal violence, the study goes on to say, had the strongest associations with subsequent traumatic events. Exposure to interpersonal violence had the strongest associations with subsequent traumatic events. So their conclusions Given the near ubiquity of exposure, in other words, everybody experiences it, limited resources, and there are limited resources, may best be dedicated to those that are more likely to be further exposed, such as victims of interpersonal violence.
Wow.
Identifying mechanisms that account for the associations of prior interpersonal violence with subsequent trauma is critical to develop interventions to prevent re-victimization.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. I think there's so many thoughts whizzing around my head right now, but I think firstly, it just shows how trauma is experienced by so many people.
Yeah.
Globally, it's not even to do with a particular nation, but there's just a global experience there. But then also, I just thought what you said right at the end with the conclusions, what we're seeing then is like, especially with the interpersonal violence space, but trauma begets trauma. So there's this cycle of trauma, and I think that the challenge then is, how do we stop the cycle? Similar to the tsunami. It's the same, isn't it? It's like it just keeps occurring and reoccurring over and over the different stages. So I think the big question for us is, how can we stop this cycle? How can we interject? I think being a human being, unfortunately, in the world that is very broken, the likelihood that we'll experience trauma is very high.
Yeah.
But how do we stop it from just getting out of control, and that's what we can do, right?
Yeah. I had debated about calling it the tsunami of trauma and called it the tsunami of stress, because depending upon the level of stress, we can experience that escalation. With trauma, it's why the tsunami goes all the way through all the stages.
Wow.
With stress, it may escalate, but it doesn't necessarily get all the way there. So,
interesting.
Because of the criteria being used, including only people who had exposure to threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence, which doesn't include all sorts of other traumatic experiences, the results of the survey are undoubtedly even higher than 70%.
Yeah.
7 out of 10 people meet the limited definition of trauma across 24 different countries on 6 continents.
That's absolutely...
It's the human condition. It's the human experience. So with the results being actually higher by including the implication that trauma isn't just about those 3 things, that pretty much means, I think, that nearly everyone has experienced trauma to one degree or another, which leads us to considering the impact of trauma. Because for some, they can be in a traumatic experience just like somebody else and be in the very same one with them. And one person is profoundly impacted and the other not so much. So, unfortunately, we don't have time to consider the impact of trauma unless people are going to be listening for hours. But the impact of trauma on human beings in this conversation, we can at least begin it, I think.
Yeah. And I'd love to begin that conversation, because I think there is, like you say, we can't go into the whole impact of it, but it would be good to just go into it slightly.
And if I may interject, one of the reasons is because of the nature of trauma, we have this intuitive sense of, this is unique to me.
Yeah.
And I'm not just part of the human community. This isolates.
It's so isolating, isn't it? And yet we're all experiencing
Yes.
it. So that's helpful to know that.
Yeah.
To think, actually, this is the human condition. It's okay to talk about it. And there are ways to heal. I think just knowing that the majority of people have some level of trauma they're dealing with that's impacting them, whether they know the beach ball is there or not, is helpful for us to connect and go, actually, together maybe we can heal too.
Yeah. So there's one major impact we could begin that conversation with, and that's trauma is what starts the tsunami. of stress or the tsunami of trauma, it's what starts it.
Wow.
The first stage of stress and need is where we flee the sensed or perceived threat because we feel insecure and inadequate. That sensing or perceiving it is because of trauma.
So that's what initiates the tsunami of stress.
And there may actually, and this is what is very confusing to many people, there may not actually even be a threat. And it's very confusing to the other person if there's somebody else involved because they know there is no threat.
But it's because of trauma that they're perceiving something to be a
and
threat.
Sensing.
Yes.
There's a threat here.
Uh-huh. So it's like they're in fight and flight.
Exactly. They're in flight. They haven't gotten to fight yet, but they're in fight. And that first stage of stress and need is where we flee the sensed or perceived threat because we feel insecure and inadequate, and trauma makes us feel insecure and inadequate.
Yeah.
And that escalates into the second stage, like that, of distress and discontent, where we attempt to fight the sensed or perceived threat that may not even exist.
This is boxing gloves time, right?
Yep, because we feel powerless.
Yeah.
To do anything about it. Those are the direct result and manifestation of trauma.
Wow.
It is the negative anticipation of the second stage that energizes the third and fourth stages, where we avoid and isolate ourselves, and when running and hiding just make matters worse. And then we become resistant, defiant, angry, and non-assertive. We become passive or passive-aggressive or just aggressive, and it's like that. That can and often does happen in minutes. But with unrelieved trauma, people often live in the distress and discontent stage because the impact of trauma is such that stress and need are simply a constant.
Yeah.
It just always is.
Yeah. That's interesting. Just that when you think about people who haven't maybe going back to the beach ball thing, there's a repression there. They don't even know trauma's there.
No.
They haven't acknowledged it. They don't know that they're trying to balance.
There's
on the
just
ball.
That stress and need of trying to balance on a beach ball.
And they literally live in the first two stages of the tsunami of stress.
Yep. So there is no sense of contentment, like in rational intimacy. So there is no rational intimacy. It's just the irrational intimacy of the tsunami of stress, that tsunami of trauma, and it's an irrational intimacy that's being experienced.
Yeah, I find that really helpful, Tom. And I think the issue of contentment is spot on. As you're talking, I'm just thinking about my own journey because, we all do. I think even as we're talking, I'm sure you're thinking about
absolutely
your story. And
yep.
But I think my experience of moving from, with AHA, with the problem solving, with the spiritual, the journey that I've been on is that I think, when I think about the beach ball, I think actually a lot of the time now I can sense it's deflated actually. But when I think back, I think into some of the big sections of my life, I think, for sure I lived through it, a long time in the repression stage, not having a clue why I felt so unstable.
Yeah.
What is wrong with me? Body, mind, and spirit. Unstable, but not knowing the beach ball was there.
Yep.
Then I feel like I kind of moved into this, like let's look back and let's think through and look at story and look at some of those things. And it was more of the beach ball's there. Crap. Okay.
And that's a big one.
And now I'm going to learn how to balance and which is kind of better than repression, right? But I think I remember coming when I first came to you really was because I was thinking, well, I've done, I feel like I've put in some work. I've
a lot.
I've put it, I've done a lot of therapy and it was like I was learning to survive on the beach ball. How do I survive this? How do I make sure I know when I'm getting triggered now. I know that maybe there's some threat, and after about 3 days of reacting badly, I knew that actually, maybe this is like something, that I'm not seeing in the right type of way. But now I think with AHA, I feel like actually, life doesn't change. There's stress, there's triggers.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of the time I feel like, well, actually, I'm not just surviving, I'm thriving here.
And you are.
Yes. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
But I think that progression, of actually we can change, we can heal, we can take out we can't ever take away those stories of trauma.
No,
but we can
is.
look at the impact that it's having on our lives, in our bodies, in the way we're thinking and our perceptions, and ultimately the way we feel about ourselves and others,
Yeah, we don't have to live wobbling on the beach ball and being reactive.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to do that. So we're back to the generally accepted definition of trauma as a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. When people are rating their sense of stress about some issue and they're putting it at 8, 9, 10 on that scale where 10 is most severe, they're talking about trauma. Even if they don't meet that criteria, or they even think of it as trauma. It's a deeply distressing and a disturbing experience. In other words, it's traumatic.
Yeah.
So to take us back to where we started this conversation and how much different it is for me to address trauma now with AHA than it was before, I would like to share, as Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story of that client with the childhood trauma.
Mm.
So during a session with a client, I was thinking about, before I took that rabbit trail about beach balls and trauma, while he was in the part of the session where homeostasis activation was occurring, his brain brought up an involuntary autobiographical cognition, like when someone who is traumatized has an intrusive thought, except now it can be resolved. Or when you have a memory pop into your head out of the blue, particularly upsetting one, it's your brain remembering something from the past that is like what is happening now.
Mm.
Except now in AHA, it's not an intrusive thought. It's something being generated because it's productive, because the brain's about to resolve it.
Mm.
So it's not you consciously remembering it. Your brain is remembering and letting you know what it is and that it is remembering. So during homeostasis activation, the client shared what he was observing his brain involuntarily doing. And it had been all about involuntary things that were pretty typical for most everybody, like itching and twitching and changes in body temperature, seeing colors and shapes. And then for him, it shifted from the shapes and colors to what he described as like short film clips.
Hmm.
But they were not actual memories. It was more like metaphorical or symbolic ones. They were imaginative and symbolic film clips his brain was creating. As human beings, we can be imaginative and create symbols because that is a capacity in our brains. So the colors and shapes and film clips shifted, though, to something fundamental to his traumatized self-image and poor self-esteem. He said, I see an image of a picture I took of my parents at a higher angle, so they're looking up, and they're both in white, smiling at me, but I feel disgrace as they see me in a certain way I don't feel I deserve. The involuntary activity the brain generates can be sensations like itching, twitching, changes in breathing and body temperature and involuntary movements, but it can also be unusual things, weird, including the brain bringing up memories or creating shapes and images that reflect flight or fight in the sympathetic nervous system, or the relax, recover, and digest in the parasympathetic. That image of his parents smiling and his sense of disgrace is clearly sympathetic flight or fight.
Yeah.
At the end of the session with homeostasis restored, his brain brought up another involuntary autobiographical cognition in contrast to that first one. And he said, I'm seeing that same picture of my parents where they are happy and smiling, but now I have a sense that no matter what things I went through, they always love me. It's not something I can earn, just readily available to me now. It's just life's imperfections, and I am the person they see. I'm not the monster I thought I was. I'm me. I'm whole. I am a man worthy to be loved. This has been extremely helpful and cleaning to rid my mind of all those things that have happened but don't need to affect me anymore.
I love what you said about memory there as well, because actually I think there's this desire or thought that somehow we've got to recover memories to heal. And what you're saying is actually the brain it doesn't even that's a whole other podcast episode talking about memory. But the point is, it doesn't actually matter what the brain knows what you need to see. And the fact that he didn't actually need to have the memory. He didn't need to go back and understand all the details. What he needed is his brain presented him with this picture that freed him to understand that he could be loved and love himself in this moment from now on.
Reflected the freedom that was the new reality, the new normal. I am loved. I am a man worthy to be loved. I am whole. I am me. Trauma doesn't let us be me in a comfortable, contented way. Normalized trauma, that just is, but it doesn't preclude it. And that's one example. That I've so many times that I experience things just like that with people. And I hear them share that sense of serenity, internal calmness, being able to manage in the body. And then with the cognitive homeostasis, getting at those traumatized perceptions and letting those shift, allowing them to be able to shift from the seemingly rational to actually rational. And the unhealthy emotions of the seemingly rational transitioning to the healthy emotions of the actually rational.
Yeah. I love that we've ended with this story because, I've really appreciated Tom just going into this space of trauma. It is, it's a harder conversation to have because it's a hard reality, really, to think, oh my gosh, this is the human condition. There's so much brokenness, there's so much pain, there's so much trauma. But we don't want to end on that, because yes, that's true. But there's also hope.
Yep.
And that's what AHA is. It's hope.
Yeah. Pandora's box does get opened. It did get opened. But there could be a resolution of all the traumatized horror that it unleashed. Curiously, there's no myth about that. But it's not a myth. It's a reality. You've been listening to the Autonomic Healing Podcast.
Join us next time as we continue in our conversations with Tom. If you're interested in pursuing your own autonomic healing journey and want to find a practitioner, visit our website, innerworkings.org. See you at the next episode.